My name's Harald. I make electronic music under the moniker Har Allt Quintet, and both on stage and in the studio I mostly use modular synthesis. And today I want to talk about two modules my friends at Seok have created and how I use these two modules in my compositions, especially with the rhythmic parts of my music. So before talking about electronic music proper, let me zoom out a little bit and let me actually recommend a book that left quite an impression on me. So the book is called Seeing Like a State, and it's written by James C. Scott. And basically what it's about is, it is a criticism of the idea that you can plan complex systems, organic growing systems, centrally from far apart. Like for instance, think of a forest. One of the examples Scott gives is forestry. Think of a forest. What is a forest? It's a very complex system. It's an environment for creatures to live, for human creatures, non-human creatures. But at some point in history, some people figured out that you could actually use a forest, commodify it, slice it up in pieces, use it as a resource, trade it, tax it, do all these things. And in order for that to be possible, people had to come up with a way to centrally organize and structure what used to be an environment for living and then turned out to be a commodity. And forests are just one example. Think of cities, for instance. In Europe, cities used to grow organically, and in many cases then they were kind of run by centralized government institutions. And the argument Scott gives is that this doesn't work. It does not work, and if it works, it comes at a very high cost, namely at the cost of impoverishing the systems you want to centrally govern. Now you might wonder, what does anything like this have to do with electronic music and modular synthesis? And I think it does connect in very important ways, because in one sense, a problem I always had with composition in electronic music, especially with sequencing, was the idea that there is some central timeline, a MIDI clock, some central way to tell all the parts of your composition what they will end up doing at any given time in your composition. And don't get me wrong, this is perfectly okay depending on the kind of style you're interested in. I mean, if you are into acid house, then this makes perfect sense. But for my composition, it was always something that kind of turned me off. I found quite off-putting. This is exactly where Eurorack and modular synthesis doesn't really matter if it's Eurorack. I mean, you could do very similar things also with VCV rack or with pure data or with super collider or different kinds of things. But in my case, it's Eurorack. Because in modular synthesis, it's extremely easy to create what I would like to call different timelines in your patch, shifting timelines, timelines that phase in and phase out. And then I think your musical compositions, to come back to the book by James Scott, are much more like forests. They kind of live and they kind of breathe and they move forward and they interact in interesting kinds of ways. But the different compositional islands and rhythmical islands I'm using can then also, again, separate and go in different ways. And the idea for today was to first play out a patch that works in exactly that way. And also to describe a little bit then, after I played the patch, how the two phases modules I'm using, the modules my friends at Seok are designing and producing, how they actually play a crucial role in kind of branching off different temporal timelines in my composition. So perhaps first I will play out the patch, and then I will not go through all the details. You can see there is a lot of spaghetti going on here. So I will just point at a couple of ideas that I find interesting and important in my composition, and also explain how the phases modules I'm using are really crucial for setting up the patch I want to play. So now talking about the patch, as I said, I try to not have something like a centralized MIDI clock. I mean, there is a clock coming. Basically what I have here is Bitwig as my DAW, but it's basically really just a glorified tape machine with quite sophisticated audio routing where Bitwig is really strong. But basically the only thing that happens is that I have a clock signal sent out from Bitwig through my Expert Sleeper's ES9, which is an audio interface I really like, mostly because it's completely invisible. It just does what it needs to do. It sends audio and CV into my modular system and takes audio or CV back into the computer. But for the most part, it's invisible, exactly what you want with an audio card. I take one clock signal and I'm using two phases modules. And basically what it is a very, very flexible clock divider. It allows you to take a clock signal and then basically split it apart into different timelines. And this is how I create what I would like to call compositional islands or compositional or rhythmic islands in my patch. So for instance, you have different divisions from your clock and you send it, for instance, on this side here, I have a Taiko by ALM, which is really one of the drum modules I absolutely adore. And I have a trigger basically playing one of the bass drums here. I have a different bass drum up here from the Basimilus Iteritas Alta from Noise Engineering, another drum module I really like. But the interesting thing is that the two drum patterns are constantly shifting back and forth. So like they will sometimes cooperate and they will sometimes play together, but at the same time, it's important for me to have in my compositions enough freedom that these two rhythmic islands can also drift apart if they want. I have different other islands. For instance, here I have a squab rample with a bunch of samples, rhythmic samples that I'm triggering. And again, I'm using the phases module. And also, I should mention the two phases modules are combined and connected to each other. So I take one clock from the first phase, send it over into the second phases, and trigger different stuff with it. So this is the basic idea with which I hope to kind of get these moving rhythmic structures instead of having just one centralized controlled rhythmic pattern. But there's one thing I wanted to mention also in terms of what the downside of this compositional approach is. Namely, if you work with many different subdivided clocks like I do here, I think probably if you count all of them, it's around 20 timelines in the patch. If you do that, your patches tend to become very busy. A lot of things are happening at the same time, and things move in, move out, and do all kinds of weird stuff. And it's a bit of a challenge to kind of thin out your patch. And I wanted to talk also about a few techniques I use in order to thin out the many different clock signals the two phases modules give me. One option I briefly wanted to mention, and many of you who are into modular will use this, is logic operators and logic modules. The ones I like is the ornament of crime. It gives you a lot of flexibility and you can play with AND operators with XOR or OR operators, and it helps you to kind of connect two different gate lines and thin out the individual gates a little bit. Another option I'm using is Bernoulli gates, named after a family of various very famous mathematician. What a Bernoulli gate basically does is to split up a gate signal into two different channels. And depending on the probability you give between the two channels, an incoming gate will either be sent towards direction A or towards direction B. And this is of course also a way how you can branch up your patch into very interesting different rhythmic structures. One last tool I use a lot I want to mention are probability skippers. Like here I use the S090 from Ladik. And basically what this does is every single gate that comes into this module will either be being let through or be held back, depending on the probability you give the module. The Bastel compass, by the way, does something very similar. You feed it one clock signal, it outputs 3 different gate signals based on different probability distributions. So this is basically the idea of the patch, but really in the center of all of this are the 2 phases modules. What I like about them is that it is very much what you see is what you get. There is good visual feedback. In a busy patch like this, what I appreciate is that I immediately see which kinds of rhythmic structures I get, combined with logic modules, combined with all kinds of probability modules. You can create endless, interesting rhythmic structures that fade in, fade out, overlap, do all kinds of interesting things. And I think for that, the Phases module is absolutely wonderful. If you want to check one out, perhaps consider buying it from my favorite modular synthesizer store, which is Escape from Noise in Stockholm. Super well stocked, super friendly. Ulf, who runs the shop, is absolutely amazing. I can recommend the Phases, especially for rhythmic patches, and maybe the patch I showed off today can be of interest for you. And shout outs to Seok, please continue the amazing work.